Hey everybody, this is Dave here. I'm going to talk to you about our HAX data visualization techniques and what we're doing with web components and xAPI. And this particular work is meant to leverage an xAPI based standard, but also look at how we can store data locally in a database and using local storage in what's called a pouch database. And so the idea behind this is that we're going to have different web components here that will be able to emit data and send those out through and notify through a custom event called user engagement. PouchDB will then have this active listener listening for a custom event that's happened, take that data and store it locally. The idea then is that later on, once we want to be able to visualize that data, again, this is all stored data locally in local storage such that we can have an object request the data, whether it's a button click or embedded in a web component. That custom event called getData is then again embedded within PouchDB. It's listening for this getData, gets that data, and then in turn emits its own custom event that data visualization, data viz picks up and then implements Chartist render. Now what you'll notice here in all of these is that Chartist render, data viz, and PouchDB are all written such that they're compartmentalized so that they're not necessarily have all the functionality tied together. So let's take a quick look at that before we jump into the code. Okay, so here's a quick demo, and you'll notice here that we have a multiple choice quiz that very simple. If I click check answer, you'll see over here in the console I have this xAPI statement that gets sent out and stored inside our pouch database. And this is an example where I just console the writing back out so that you can track this just for troubleshooting. But eventually you can take this out of your console, obviously. So this is a fully embedded xAPI statement that we can use later. And then if you have other xAPI data, you can merge that together and do other kinds of things that people are doing with xAPI, obviously. So we can take a quick look at our code here. The idea starting out here is on our index HTML page. We're going to obviously invoke the PouchDB component. We invoke the multiple choice component. And you'll notice here this quiz name, quiz1. Remember that. We'll come back to that here in a second. And then we have some other components here as well. If I scroll down, you'll see the data viz component. And then later on, we'll see self-check is also a component that we utilize in this example as well. Back at our multiple choice element itself, you'll notice that once the particular quiz has been completed, this part of the code is where we actually look at whether or not the quiz has been submitted, and we add some functionality to this that we store this event data that we're going to pass over to through this custom event called user engagement. And if you remember, that's what PouchDB is listening for. It's waiting for this user engagement custom event. And we'll pass over the fact that it was answered. This is our verb. We get the quiz name. And if you remember, I said just a minute or so ago that the quiz name is derived from your quiz one over here, which we embed inside our quiz name. And then that way you can have independent names, and you'll see where that comes up in the visualization here later. We're going to pass over our result success. So these are all embedded inside our xAPI statement and are all consistent with that standard, that data standard. So back over here in Pouch, we scroll up here real quickly. We can see that PouchDB is listening for two kinds of events to happen. One called user engagement, and then one called get data. We'll come back to that one here in a second. So our user engagement happens, and then we execute this function here. I need to add an E in here for engagement, but we're going to then find out what kind of event that's going to happen. In this case, it's a multiple choice event. I added later on for self-check. We'll come back to that in a second. So when it's a multiple choice type event, we're going to create and build this xAPI statement. That's all this code right here. And what it does is it pulls out the display that's dynamic, the object name that's dynamic, and then some of these I just hard-coded in to keep the xAPI statement consistent. And the rest of this code here is the actual writing. As a side note, this has remote couch capabilities so that you can set up a pouch database remotely outside of the browser for synchronization, but that is yet to come. Okay, so let's kind of see this in action. Let me refresh the screen here so you can kind of get a new view of this. So you'll see again, if I do a check answer here, do a check answer here, do a check answer here, you'll see that each time we write a different xAPI statement, and so each one of these represents, in this case, this was, quiz 1, and you can kind of see that there, and then these are the same, right? These are all just values of xAPI, and you'll see that this one has 11, this one has 12, and then obviously as you go down. And these are all data that are stored inside the browser at local storage level. Very fast, not internet dependent for connectivity. You also see down here that this automatically draws our data visualization, but I'll show you how you can instigate that as well. Okay, and you'll see that every time you take a quiz, this basically just tracks whether you've taken the quiz itself. Okay, so if we kind of come back here and look at our index page, we will notice that we also can set up a paper button, and associated with that paper button is this event called get data. Okay, you can have it so that in this case it's a paper button, and if you're wondering why did that data visualization already get instigated, it's because I have this event listener as well that has a timeout, so we can kind of do it either way. So if I come back here and I refresh the screen, and you'll see that the data visualization hasn't happened yet, so that paper button, I can click to see results, and what it does is it pulls all that data that's sitting that we saw here over in console here a little bit ago, and then visualizes that. I'm not going to go into the code behind how it visualizes it, just that you can engage that visualization, right? What we can look at though is that this get data action, right, this get data event, is then tied back to that listener. If you remember, we have the original one was the user engagement, and then this other event listener is this get data. Okay, that then in turn runs this function. As we scroll down here, not too fast, we can see that this get data function, it knows that it's an all quizzes request. It can also then look for other kinds of, I have some other cases in here, but for future. And then what that does is it will then pull the data out. It gets it into a format that we can do a reduce on it, and then ultimately it sends out, it emits this custom event called show data. Okay. Over here in data viz, which if you remember, we come back here real quick. If you remember, we brought that web component into existence just by calling it here. Data viz then is going to listen for that show data, right? And what show data does is it runs this function, pulls the query data out that we just sent it from Pouch, gets it formatted properly, and then renders via Chartist render our bar chart, okay? Which then we saw back here, right? So again, keeping these all separate as much as possible. Pouch, data viz, and Chartist render, all separate web components so that you can use them however you like. So you see this shark down here. This is a self-check web component that we also have inside our LRN web components that we can use. And back to self-check, if I look at some code behind that, we'll see that it does exactly the same thing as multiple choice. It has this custom event, user engagement. I just have some data in here hard-coded that we can pass over as activity display the name of it is called self-check. Again, just kind of hard coding some things back in so that PouchDB can pick it up. Okay, so if I look at that and I instigate that particular call, I'm not sure why yet. I need to dip in to see why. The very first time you click on it, it cuts 2 records. There's an undefined getting triggered here. I gotta take a look at that. But every time I click on it subsequently, you'll see that it continually emits an xAPI statement, and you'll notice that self-check will automatically get updated in the data visualization as well. So you can kind of see it's at 9. I can keep doing this, right? And you'll notice that this will then climb to 11, right? So again, this will automatically update our data visualization, right? I can also do, take this quiz, see how I do on this quiz. Yeah, awesome. Did well on that. That was quiz 5. So you'll see that that one got a first hit down here. You'll notice that that automatically redrawed as well. So again, the good thing is you can have independent integration with all of these just by instigating a particular user engagement and having Pouch listen for that. It'll normalize it into an xAPI statement, stuff it inside your Pouch database locally, and then data visualization can pull it back out on demand. So if hopefully this is helpful to you, let me know what you think about this, and we can get this thing cleaned up and add it to some more visualization elements. Have a good one.